Okay, so now that we've kind of discussed the idea of what religions are important to look into, I'd like to bring your attention to our next study. Um, and the next study is called, oops, excuse me, um, Glossolalia is associated with differences in biomarkers of stress and arousal among apostolic Pentecostals. And this study came out in 2011. So before we start out, I kind of want to give you a little bit of a background into um, the ideas behind the study. So the first idea that I think is really important is this idea of allostasis, which is the belief that one's body makes adjustments to the set points of stress response to maintain stability. So this stability through change, or allostasis, is kind of the concept that drove this study among apostolic Pentecostals. So the goal was to test whether or not glossolalia, as a form of speaking in tongues, would stimulate arousal that entrains a stress response so as to reduce reactions to normal daily stressors. So the group that was studied is a form of religion called Apostolic Pentecostals, and this group of people is basically a pretty charismatic form of evangelical Protestants, and this group in particular emphasizes personal experience with God through what they call a gift of wisdom or speaking in tongues, which is kind of a way for people in the congregation to show that they believe in God and that they've accepted Christ as Savior according to their beliefs. And so researchers set out to find out if there's anything about this particular form of worship, glossolalia, which is the act of speaking in tongues, that will reduce stress in the long term. That's particularly effective. So I want to show you this video really quickly of some people who are responding.
Bring me those young children in the back. Quickly, quickly, get them up here. The power is so strong on them. The power is so strong on them. My God, carry him if you need to. Carry him if you need to.
So if you listened through that video, that was just like a compilation of different examples of people speaking in tongues. Basically, the practice is this sort of like disassociative, hyper-aroused state of worship, which usually is characterized by people speaking in a sort of language, if you will, that is made up of different kinds of sounds or noises. And they claim that the Holy Spirit is actually speaking through them. And so for me, this was really interesting because when I started looking at the different studies that were involved, I saw a study that was mentioned in the paper that was about how people who speak in tongues have um, different parts of their brain that are activated. So on the left, you can see somebody who was singing a gospel song, and the lit up more activated parts in red in the frontal lobes. And then on the right, you see the speaking in tongues person. And so if this is truly a dissociative state, these brain scans kind of support that in showing that there's less activity in those who were speaking tongues. So it's kind of an interesting state that people use for worship. So in this particular study, we looked into apostolic Pentecostals in New York's Hudson Valley. The paper didn't mention why necessarily New York's Hudson Valley, but that must be a place where there's a larger density. And the study actually happened in two parts. So the whole study stretched from September 2006 to June 2009, but it was done in two ways. So first, 6 charismatic churches had ethnographic surveys. So basically somebody attended that church for the period of time. I think for that it was specifically a year that they would stay with the church. And then they would conduct interviews, 15 interviews with each of the people who were part of those charismatic churches. And then the second part of the study was for just 2 churches, and those churches had members that were recruited for a biomarker and questionnaire part of the study. And so out of those 52 participants in the 2 churches, 25 were male, 27 were female. So they recruited from both sexes. And the only other requirements were that you were over the age of 18 and under 25 weeks pregnant. The study did not scan for any other medications that were being used for differences. So the first method they used was through the Glossolalia questionnaire. And this was actually really interesting because it tested kind of religiousness and daily stress levels. So the questionnaire would ask questions like, how many times has glossolalia been experienced in one's lifetime, the duration, the intensity, the frequency of the average experiences, and self-control or awareness and ability to recall experiences. And then those were kind of scored, and then the researchers could wean out those who may not truly be glossolalists, and find those who are really on the higher end of the spectrum of doing this. But these studies also took into account social status, social support system, faith maturity, and also relationship status, which was kind of interesting. So the next part of this was collecting the saliva sample, and this was done for the two churches. It was done for 3 weeks, over the course of 3 weeks, on Mondays and Sundays. So the idea was you would have a sample taken on the days of worship and then the days right after the days of worship. So for most people, it was Sunday. So they would take 4 samples a day on Sunday, starting at 10 a.m., and then they would take another 4 samples on Monday, starting at 10 a.m. in time increments. And then as part of collecting that saliva sample, one control I thought that was really cool that the researchers put in was that they actually contacted by text or by phone call each person who was involved in the study for those 3 weeks, each time they were supposed to submit the sample. So there was that kind of reminder that they put in. And then researchers took the saliva samples back and did assays for cortisol and alpha amylase, which we've learned in our class are biomarkers for stress. So once they did that, they kind of broke down the data in a few different ways. So they did a lot of statistical analysis. In fact, one of the things that was most interesting to me was the way that they chose to break down those who were glossolalists. So if you look at the top, you'll see the letters HGE, and that stands for high glossolalia experience, and then LGE, which is low glossolalia experience. And so those were based on the surveys that were conducted that asked about questions about duration and consistency. And it was really interesting to see the factors that were noted to be significant. And so those were particularly social support that was significant, and then church status, which again related to this idea of how active one was in their either high or low glossolalia experience. So they broke down the data like that. And then the next thing that they did was do a kind of mapping of the interaction of cortisol and alpha amylase by time. And so you can see again the LGE and the HGE. And for the most part, if we look on the sampling times for alpha amylase, it seems that people were not very stressed out on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. And that pretty consistently for the low and high experiencers. And then if you look at Monday from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., you see a sharp spike in the high experiencers, which is kind of interesting, and the researchers go into that and why that might be happening. And then also interesting is the kind of cortisol levels and how the trend is for them to decrease. But another interesting thing to note is, again, here you can see that the low experiencers, who are denoted by the dotted line, had a higher level of stress the Monday after going to a service than did those who were high experiencers. And since we know that that's related to kind of status within the church, there might be some sort of connection there. So the findings of the study were really that on the service day, on the Sunday, there was an overall increase in cortisol, in cortisol and in alpha amylase, and that was irrespective of the role in the church. But on the non-service day, on the Monday following, for the high glossolalia experiencers, there was a decrease in stress, and this was related to the role in the church. And so I just want to, in discussing the study, talk about a few of the flaws. So one was that the sample size was really small. The researchers themselves admit this, that um, their findings, they really did a lot of statistical analysis, but there's a limit to how it can be applied because the sample size was so small. Another flaw of the study was the way that glossolalia was classified, for example, and quantified. The saliva collection that occurred did not have a baseline or anything before 10 a.m. on that Sunday, because a lot of the services were before 10 a.m. and people refused to, the participants didn't want to take a saliva sample while they were in the service or before the service. And so that was kind of a problem to not see where their baseline levels of stress were before the service. Um, and then the survey also didn't take into account the non-worship items that affect stress, like diet, which was something that previous studies had taken into account. And the researchers chose not to because they didn't want to place more of a burden on the participants, which was a personal choice. And then saliva collection and consistencies. So if somebody, even though they received a phone call or text about taking the saliva, um, they may not have necessarily done it at that time. And there were a few participants who were eliminated from the study, disqualified because they didn't collect the sample on time. But this is a really exciting study because the researchers call it the first neurotheology study. This is really a way of integrating kind of more of a topic that you would find in a sociology field, and really trying to find the science of what's happening behind it. So that's really exciting. And I like the fact that it's a natural setting that they're trying to kind of collect data in. It wasn't like those scans that I showed you a little bit earlier, where it had to be done outside of the church. And so that's a really interesting way to study the dissociation that we're seeing here. And then it serves as a model for future studies. And I am somebody who's like experienced this sort of. I haven't experienced glossolalia, but I one time went to like a church tent, and that's kind of where I got my interest in this because it's really really high energy, and so I just was fascinated that this was so natural to people. And so I think that it would be really interesting to have a study that looks more closely at the stress levels around the experience of glossolalia, not necessarily the day of worship, because there are some papers that I've seen that say that stress is really increased and hyped up and necessarily hyped up in order to get someone to a stage where they can speak in tongues. So that would be an increase in cortisol. And then others who say that the release after an experience of intense speaking in tongues is a huge stress reliever. So I'd be interested to know the role that stress plays more intimately with the experience. And so this was just exciting for me to see as a model of ways to kind of quantify glossolalia and study it and see the restrictions on this field of study. So that was really exciting for me.